Welcome to the Riga Security Forum podcast. My name is Reinhard Krumm. I'm the head of the FAS in the Baltic countries, and our guest today is Thomas Greminger, who has been the OSCE Secretary General for a while. He also had the chairmanship Switzerland in 2014, which was a very, very difficult year. But it was seen, and it is seen in OSCE circles as the best chairmanship ever, and Thomas Greminger was heading it. It was the beginning of the war against Ukraine, at least some people would say this, 2014 first part. The subject today, and Thomas, thank you very much for joining us from Geneva. Our studio here is in Riga. And if you want to have a look at the podcast, which have been recorded already, and for the following, you can go to www.rigasecurity-forum.liia.lv. The Latvian Institute for International Affairs is hosting these podcasts, and they're doing this for the second time. Thomas, our subject today is how to make the Eastern Neighborhood countries stable, secure, and prosperous. And if we talk about the 6 countries, I mean Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and the Southern Caucasus, and Belarus, Moldova, Ukraine, in more in Central Europe, we are seeing an unstable neighborhood. We see an aggressive Russia, which has attacked Ukraine, but also a country which laid instability in almost all the countries I just mentioned. Only Belarus so far has not a frozen conflict. Thomas, you have been, as I said before, the head of the OSCE. You have been the Secretary General. You also are the director of the Geneva Centre for Security Policy. You're dealing with these questions every day. So I'll start with a very, very broad question, just to come closer to the subject. So, what can we do to make sure that these 6 countries are less unstable, in other words, more stable, so they will be more prosperous? That's so important, more secure, without, of course, telling them what to do. This is not the point at all. Working together. Is there anything in your experience what can be done right now?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Reinhard, for inviting me to this conversation. And indeed, the war does not make a constructive discussion on these so-called in-between states easier, even though we would have acknowledged it as one of the most fundamental challenges to European security, but clearly, and even in a pre-war setting, I haven't really witnessed a constructive discussion. The war makes it even more challenging. And I would say, the starting point of a constructive discussion could be a negotiated end to this war that would be perceived by main stakeholders, including, of course, Ukraine, as fair. And a fair end to the war, I think, would, in a way, provide an environment that would, at least in theory, allow for a constructive discussion. If there is, a clear winner to the war, again, I suspect that then the answer to the future of the in-between countries would be relatively straightforward, in the sense that basically the in-between states would, to a large extent, perhaps not all 6, but most of them would, gradually join the camp of the winner. If there is not a clear winner, I think the challenge of dealing with these states constructively will stay with us. And again, but to respond to your question, what would be, what is possible right now? I think as long as the war is ongoing, I don't think that we can have a constructive discussion. And a good starting point would indeed be a negotiated end to the war that would be considered to be fair.
If we look at the three dimensions, and I'm basically concentrating now on Moldova and Ukraine and Georgia, since they do have the association agreement with the EU. Then we're looking at hard security, we're looking at the economy, and we're looking at the human dimension, and these are the three baskets of the OSCE. And for the last couple of years, and also in your leadership at the OSCE, connectivity was a big subject, bringing countries together, even at the time with Russia. Is connectivity still something you would say is worthwhile pursuing?
Definitely, but I think connectivity should also be, perceived to be more than just a technical concept. I think it initially, when we launched this discussion on connectivity in an OSCE setting, it was clearly perceived to be a political concept, meaning that countries, and in particular those countries in between, they should actually be also turned into bridge countries, economically speaking. That is, countries should, while they would probably choose a path of stronger integration into the European Union, that they would or could do so without, basically then kind of joining exclusively one camp, without having a possibility to continue interacting economically, trading, investing, etc., into the other camp. So I think we should prevent these countries from a either-or choice. They should have a possibility to go for a process of rapprochement to the EU economic sphere, without having to totally lose ties with the Eurasian Economic Union, with the Russian Federation. And I think that would be my political understanding of connectivity, allowing these countries to do both, get closer to that economic sphere that they would choose. And my assumption would be that for the bulk of these countries, this would be the European Union, but without then abandoning, economic ties with the other economic sphere.
Yeah, the problem is that before the 24th of February, this concept was again and again offered. But I wonder how serious that was. My impression is that also the EU, I think Barroso has a very famous quote on that, it was the either or. It is you're either with us or you're with somebody else. Now Russia has enforced that, even though I'm not really sure that's the real reason for all this. But so should the OSCE do more on this? Or is the OSCE, and you know it all perfectly well, at the moment an organization, because of the huge polarization, is not really able to do that? Or could it, after all, work on these three dimensions? You mentioned also the second, connectivity, but also on the other one, the human dimension. Could it be that the OSCE is, after all, one of the major organizations, even though it doesn't look like that at all?
Well, that's of course a very good question, particularly in current times. And unfortunately, I would tend to agree with you that right now the OSCE is perhaps not really, capable to act in a compelling way because the organization is in a survival mode. I think there are a number of very critical institutional questions that need to be answered in the months to come, and only provided participating states want to respond to these questions in a constructive positive way, the organization will remain capable of acting. Now, provided this is the case, I would of course argue the OSCE is very well placed, to support these countries in all three areas: on security, on economy, and in seriously pursuing this concept of connectivity, but also when it comes to supporting democratic reforms in these countries, strengthening institutions in democratic institutions, rule of law institutions, but also respect for human rights. I think the OSCE has lots of very useful tools, and then also to have a constructive discussion on the related security challenges, obviously on status, on security guarantees. In theory, the OSCE would be well placed to conduct these kinds of discussions. But I think in the immediate future, participating states of the OSCE will have to make sure that the organization is actually surviving and capable, to act, to assume these kinds of purposes in the future.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm just wondering, before we met here, we had a little chat, and you mentioned the report of the eminent persons in 2015, which was after the annexation of Crimea, and the OSCE had the initiative, I think it was your initiative as a matter of fact, to have an eminent person panel, people who are still willing to think about the future. And the report came out in 2015, and the headline was "Back to Diplomacy." Now that was a bold statement, after the annexation of Crimea. Would it be feasible, would it be a good idea, again, to have this kind of panel with people who are still willing to look into things and possibly also concentrating, of course, on the countries of the Eastern Partnership, the geographically in-between countries, meaning between the EU and Russia? What do you think?
Well, I would definitely say that most of the recommendations, if not all, of this report by the panel of eminent persons these recommendations are still very much valid. But I think it's worthwhile, reminding us why we launched the reflection of this panel of eminent persons. And this was basically once we did some partly successful work on preventing a further escalation of what then was called, the crisis in and around Ukraine. We felt in the course of summer, we felt, but okay, crisis management is important. It's important to prevent a further escalation, even though it's true, we could not prevent the illegal annexation of Crimea. But I think what we managed to do is prevent an escalation of the crisis into something that would spread all over the region. And here I think the OEC managed to show the effectiveness of its conflict management tools. But the question was now what to do with the root causes of these tensions, with this conflict between, let's say, Russia and the West that had been simmering for quite a long time, and we felt this conflict would need to be addressed. Only it was quite obvious that governments, track one actors at that time, had absolutely no appetite to, in particular after the annexation of Crimea, to move into such a discussion, including with the Russian Federation. So the alternative was indeed to launch experts and have them reflect on how to tackle these root causes of tensions and this widening gap between Russia and the West in European security. And I think we, of course, launched this work very much with the perspective that at some point the crisis scene around Ukraine would be solved, the conflict settled, and we could then move on to discuss these more fundamental issues. Now, as we know, we did not manage to resolve the conflict in Ukraine, and the conflict kept festering, and so and then even escalated further on the 24th of February this year. So the question is, what can be done today? I'm not sure that it would make sense to relaunch another panel of experts, but I would definitely say it is important that think tankers, experts keep reflecting, what would happen if this war would come to an end. How could we get back to a European peace and security order that indeed contains some elements of cooperative security beyond a simple reliance on deterrence? I think this kind of reflection is important, and I think we better conduct it now in order to be ready should the political environment become more favorable.
Thank you, Thomas. There is the new national security strategy out of the United States of America. There have been discussions on that, and one of the criticism is it is basically what the US has always been doing. Now the time is difficult, but they do want to continue and kind of do it better. But the environment has changed completely. So the criticism is this is a wish list, and there is no way that the US can do that. I don't want to go in details. I just want to come back to the wish list. A strategy is basically to define what you're aiming for, and then you also define the instruments you would like to use or you have on your you have on your hands to achieve that. And here's my question. So what exactly are we aiming for? And let's be specific now for Ukraine. And again, if we say, or if I'm saying we, of course we include Ukraine. What are we aiming for? And what are our instruments to achieve it? What would you say? And at the same time, be realistic. What is it what we are aiming for, or Ukraine is aiming for with us, or the vice versa?
Well, I think we need to acknowledge that while there is Western unity when it comes to defending and protecting Ukraine, there at the same time I think, quite different objectives when it comes to the end state of what we expect to get at the end of this war. I think there are those that simply want to protect Ukraine, its territorial integrity, its legitimate right for statehood. And then there are those that want to go much further, that would like to see Russia strategically weakened for the next 30 to 50 years. And I think depending on the objective, you would have to also choose different instruments. A second point that I would like to make, and this is it's obvious, but I think it needs to be said. You need obviously to tango. So in a way, if we want to come to a negotiated end of this war that is considered to be fair by major stakeholders, you need, of course, the belligerents to be ready to negotiate such a settlement, but you also need key stakeholders to be in support of such an outcome. And I think both preconditions are for the time being clearly not given. I think that this Bill Sartman's famous mutually hurting stalemate has clearly not been reached, and this is why we will see military means prevailing for at least months to come, perhaps for even longer. But again, I think at some point this war has to stop, and then we'll have to see. Is the Russian Federation ready to get back to respecting internationally agreed rules? I think we could indeed launch a discussion that would take us back to reintroducing some cooperative elements to European security. If not, we will stick to a security order that exclusively relies on deterrence. And I think the West has clearly the tools to do so. But of course, it comes at a high cost financially, but also politically. If a future European security order is exclusively based on deterrence.
What would be your comment if in a conference a security specialist would say, you know what, in this situation, give war a chance concerning Ukraine?
Well, I would perhaps say that if I would perhaps refer to the quote of Bill Sartman that I have just quoted, and clearly, as long as the sides keep believing that by military means they are capable of improving their negotiation positions, they will continue to wage a high intensity conflict. but this comes at enormous costs, and perhaps experts, that use these kinds of arguments would probably tend to underestimate, not least also the human cost. There are daily there combatants losing their life, but there is also a high civilian cost. So this comes at enormous human suffering, and it comes at high economic costs, political costs. And what I'm afraid is, the longer that this war goes on, the deeper we move into the logic of a new Cold War, a Cold War 2.0, and I was, I still grew up, including as a member of the Swiss Armed Forces, in a Cold War setting. I was still shaped by the images of the enemy of this first Cold War, and I had hoped that I wouldn't have to go through such an era again, but this is exactly what seems to be happening, and I think that's a pity. So in a way, I think we should all be interested to find a negotiated end to this war. But as I said before, you need both sides to be willing to come with constructive attitudes to the negotiation table in order to achieve an outcome that can be considered to be fair, which, as I argued before, would be a basis to then for a serious attempt to reconstruct a European peace and security order.
You have been on both sides. You have been a diplomat, you have been an acting person in being a Secretary General. You could set the agenda to a certain amount. Now you work for a think tank, so it's track 2. My question is, if, in your opinion, politicians should step up, they should do more. And I'm asking this question on the old saying of a German chancellor who said, peace is not everything, but without peace, everything is nothing. Do politicians have to step up?
In principle, absolutely. I think we need political leadership if we want to get out of this current impasse in European security. There is no doubt about it. And I think I would also argue there was not enough political leadership over the last years in terms of seizing opportunities, to bring answers to these conflicts between Russia and the West, between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. I think these conflicts would not have needed to turn into a war. And I'm saying so, without wanting to give any legitimacy to the brutal Russian invasion in Ukraine from the 24th of February on. I'm simply saying I think there were missed opportunities over the last decade in addressing, mitigating these conflicts and lowering the tensions. We all, saw the tensions rising, and I felt there was not enough done to counter these trends. Now today, it's of course for any politician that is not representing any of the sides very difficult to speak on behalf of one of the parties, in particular on part of Ukraine. I mean, who ones today tell the Ukrainians now to stop the war and go to the negotiation table. I mean, they've been invaded, their territory has been occupied. So I think for a politician these days to give wise advice is very challenging, because at the end of the day, it's the Ukrainians themselves that need to come up with a decision at what point they want to resume the political strategic negotiations with the Russian Federation. So I have a lot of sympathy for a reluctance of politicians to give wise advice right now. At the same time, I would of course wish we could find an end of this war as quickly as possible.
That was Thomas Greminger, former Secretary General of the OSCE and now the Director of the GCSP. Thomas, thank you very much for a very thoughtful analysis. I think this is very much in the spirit of the OSCE and very much in the spirit of the GCSP. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the audience, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.